So last time we talked about 2D arrays and nested loops and how we can, let's say, access and work with 2D arrays through nested loops. But today we're going to be talking about something a little different. We're going to be talking about functions. And functions are actually something we brought up before. We talked about functions before. We talked about string functions, the built-in string functions that we used, such as length, if you remember. We talked about find and substring. And there are so many different functions we're going to be talking about today as well. We're also going to be learning how we can make our own functions that help us execute our own code, or like that can help us execute something that we want the compiler to execute. So the thing about functions is that basically they are containers, just like variables, but they contain basically a bunch of code, or like a block of code that executes and does a specific job and has a specific function. Okay. And in order for you to use these functions in your program, you have to give the compiler, you have to give C++ a couple of information. So you have to give C++ a return type. Now, a return type, and we're going to be talking about returns and return type in a bit as well. But for now, when your function does not return anything to the main function, or when we are not expecting an answer, or we're not expecting to get a result or anything, or for example, if we just want to see out a statement, we can use a return type called void. And void is basically a function, or it's a return type that, again, does not return anything to the main function. And we're going to be talking about returning values to the main function in a bit. But for now, let's stick with void. So, for example, I want to create a function that cout, or like that tells the user, hello user, for example. So we can call our function say hello and give it 2 parentheses, and open and close our brackets. So this is a very, very simple function. All this function does is simply cout hello user. Oops, hello user. And line. Okay. So let's try to run our code and see what it gives us. So when we run our code and when we check our console, it basically does nothing. And that's because we have to always call our functions in the main function. So you can't just write your function and just assume that the compiler will do whatever you want it to do. So you have to call it. And calling the function is a very, very simple thing. All you have to do is just name the function, open and close brackets, and end with a semicolon. So let's try to run our code again and see what it gives us. It tells us hello user. Now, again, this is a very, very simple function. All it does is tell the user hello user. It gives us a hello user string when we run it. And that's basically all it does. But the thing about functions is that you can give them something called a parameter. And we talked about parameters before. And basically, parameters are the information you give the function. And then the function would use this information to execute the code. So for example, I don't want it to print out hello user. I want it to print out a name. So I will have to provide the function with a string parameter and call it name, for example. And I would cout hello name, just like we always do. But now you have to provide the function with this piece of information. So back when we go back to the main, we would have to give a, we would have to fill in the we'd have to fill in the parameters basically. So you have to give it a value. So I wanted to say hello Sally, for example. And when I run the code, it's not going to be printing hello user, it's going to be printing hello Sally. So again, quick recap. This is a very, very simple function. All it does is cout hello name, and it basically gets the name from it gets the parameter from the main function, and we set the parameter as a string. But again, the thing about functions is that you can include more than one parameter. So if I want to build my project or like build my function even more, I wanted to say, hello, Sally, you are 17, for example, or you are, or your favorite color is yellow, for example. But for now, let's stick with age. So if I want to include age, I would have to include it in the parameters over here. So I would say int age, since age is an integer, but we always have to remember to include the parameter back in the main function. So let's start with Sally. And hello, Sally. Let's write. You are age. Okay, so it's supposed to print hello, Sally. You are 19. So we run our code and see. Hello, Sally, you are 19. Okay, awesome. So what if I, for example, put this function below the main function? Now, what functions basically do is that, so in the main function, when it sees say hello, it would jump to the function and execute the code and then go back here and execute whatever is after the function call. But if we actually have the function below the main function, let's see what the compiler gives us. It's going to give us an error. And that's because the main function does not know what say hello is. It's not familiar with say hello. It's like you are, I don't know. It's basically as if you're giving a value in thin air. So the thing that we can do is that we can actually include something called a prototype. And a prototype is basically just the name of the function, its return type, and the parameters that it receives. All we have to do is end it with a semicolon and include it before the main. So this is basically, and by the way, you can just keep the functions above. You don't need to include the prototype. But later on, when you have tens and even hundreds of functions, it's not going to look very nice to have all these functions stacked up together on top of the main function. You would have to scroll hundreds of lines to find your main function. So having a prototype eases the process, and it basically clarifies what functions we can use in this program, and we can include the implementation of the function under the main function, so it would look a little more organized. So if we run the code again and see what it gives us, it's supposed to just print hello, Sally, you are 19. Okay, so again, this is a very basic function. So let's try to edit our function and add some specs to it. For example, we can add, we can receive the information from the user and send the information to the function and make it a little more user-friendly. So for example, not every user that's going to be using the program is going to be called Sally, and not every user is going to be 19. So we can actually ask the user for the information and send this information to the function and make it a little more user-friendly. So string name, cin, or we can just declare them all together. So cin name. For now, I'm not including any prompts, and cin age. Okay, so I want you guys to help me. If I wanted to receive the information from the user and send this information through the parameters, what exactly do I need to include over here? What do you think? So how can I send the information? So I'm receiving the name and I'm receiving the age from the user, and I want to send this information to the function. What do you think?
We write inside the parentheses name, comma, age.
Absolutely. So it's name, comma, age. And let's try to run our code and see. So it's going to ask for it. Technically, we're supposed to have a prompt, but for now, I'm just going to include Kathy, for example, and 45. It's going to print, hello, Kathy, you are 45. Awesome. Okay. So also what's really special about functions is that you don't need to write the code all over again in order for you to, let's say, execute the function multiple times. So if I had different information that I wanted to attain from the user, I can just simply, let's, for example, copy this. Or for now, you know what? Let's forget about the user and just include information of our own for now. So for example, we're going to say Kathy 45, and I'm going to copy this and print it 2 more times. So what's really cool about functions is that you do not need to see out the statement 3 different times in order for you to execute the function 3 times. And for now, yes, this is a very simple function. It's just a see out statement. But when you have functions with, again, hundreds and thousands of code, it's not going to be very efficient to copy paste and to re-enter your code all over again. And that's why functions really ease the process. So here we have Kathy, Sally, and Sarah. So it's supposed to print Kathy is 45, Sally is 19, and Sarah is 70. So it really eases the process for you as a programmer to basically reuse your code. And by reusing your code, I mean recalling your function multiple times in the main function. So let's try to before we move on to the return and before we move on to return statement, I want you guys to help me create a function that receives a number and identifies whether this number is an even or odd number. Okay? So it receives one number, and for now we are not returning anything. So we're going to be using void, and I'm going to call my function even or odd. Even or odd, and it's going to receive one number. Okay, so I want you to help me. This is an easy one, and we did this so many different times. So I named my prototype. Okay, I'm going to copy it and implement it below the main. But again, you don't need to do this. You can implement it above the main. But in order for it to be clear and in order for your program to not get a little messy, you can include the implementation below and include your prototypes above. Okay, so what would be my first step? Let's start with the function before going to the main. What do you think I should be doing here?
If n modulo to equals 0, see out n is an even number.
N is an even number. Excellent. Okay.
Else see out n is an odd number.
Excellent. So see out n is an odd number. Perfect. Okay. So we have our function ready. Again, a very simple function. It just tells the user if the number is even or odd. Now, how exactly can I call this function from the main? Because again, if you run your code without calling it in the main, it's not going to execute anything. So what do you think? There are 2 steps.
First, we need to scan CNN.
Okay, so before seeing is CNN, we have to declare n, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. So integer n, excellent, CNN. Okay, what would be our next step?
Even or odd between the parentheses.
Even or odd. Absolutely, even or odd and between the parentheses. Okay, excellent. So let's try to run our code and see. So it's going to ask for a number. We didn't include the prompt, but I'm going to include 9, for example. 9 is an odd number. Excellent. So our function works. And then also the thing about functions is that you can use this function in a different program. So you can basically copy this program, copy this function and use it in any program that you wish to use it in. Okay. So moving on to the return statement. Now, sometimes you might be using functions or you might be needing functions that will basically return a specific or like return a value. And you as a programmer, you have to deal with that value. You have to know where to store that value. So for example, if I wanted to create a function that finds the cube of a number, so finds cube, and I'm gonna call it cube, I will have to specify the return type. So for now, I will include integer. I want to return an integer number to the main, and this function will basically find the cube of a function of a integer number. Okay. Now, the only difference between integer or string or a double, float, character is that when you include a return data type that isn't void, then the main function expects you to, the main function basically expects to receive a type of information from the function. So here, the information we are returning will be the cube of number of integer n. Okay, so a cube is basically it's not a number times itself 3 times. So we can actually store the cube in integer result and say integer result is n times n times n. Since n is the number we are sending to the function, and then all we have to do is include something called a return statement and return result. Okay, so all we did here was specify our return type, which in this case is an integer. Again, it does not necessarily need to be an integer. It can be an integer, a float, a double, a string, or a character. But here we are returning the cube of a number. So we are storing the number, we are storing the cube in result, and we are returning result to the main function. But the thing is that you cannot just return the value and not store it somewhere or not show it to the user. It can't just be there in the main function, just floating around. That just doesn't work. So we can, for example, see out cube and give it 2, for example, or we can store this function in a variable and call it, again, integer result. They don't need to be the same name, by the way, but just for the sake of clarity, I am going to store cube 2, or let's try 3, and see what it gives us. And when you store this value in a variable in the main function, all you have to do is then see out result. Okay, and let's try and L here. So these are 2 ways to print out the information to the user. But the only difference is that we here, using int result, we are basically storing the information in a variable, but here all we're doing is printing the information and not storing it anywhere. So let's try with our cube function. Again, our cube function just simply finds the cube of n. So the first one is supposed to give us 8, and the next one would give us 27. Since 2 cubed is 8 and 3 cubed is 27. And of course, you can receive the information from the user. You can int num, for example, see in num, and send num through the parentheses. Okay, and num in this case would be a parameter. Okay, awesome. And again, it's not necessarily integer, it can be any data type. So I want us to try to come up with different functions and try to make our program modular. And when I say modular, I mean create a program that consists of various functions that can be recycled, basically. So when you have a function, you can actually recycle it in a different program. So this is what makes your function modular, is when you have a couple of different functions that actually help you make a more modular function and recycle these functions in any different program you might need in the future. So I want us to try to create a function that, let's say, decides whether a person can vote or not. So I'm going to call it can vote. Volatile, can vote. And I'm going to call my function can vote. And I'm going to give it an integer. And the integer is age. Okay? So I want you to help me. So I mentioned that we can include absolutely any data type we need as a return type for the function. So in order for a person to be able to vote, they have to be over the age of 18. They have to be 18 or older. So I want this function to help us figure out if this person can vote or not. So I'm going to keep integer num, C in num, but I want you to help me with the data type. Okay, so we're going to keep that for now. And I'm going to copy this and implement it below. And start implementing our function. So again, if a person is 18 or above, I will have to tell the user that they can vote. And if they are not 18, if they are below 18, then they cannot vote. So it's a true or false value, basically. And if you remember, did we talk about a data type that has true or false, has a value of true or false? Do you remember a data type that we talked about that has true or false values? Mm-hmm.
Boolean.
Boolean, exactly. So I want to create a Boolean function that returns true if this person can vote and false if this person cannot vote. So we figured out the first piece of information. We figured out the return type. So bool, and we're of course going to have to edit it above. And again, if you remember, bool accepts true or false values. So what should I want you girls to help me. What should I include inside this function? And then I want you to help me figure out how we can see out this information to the user. So my first step. What's my first step? I'm going to give you a hint. It's an if statement. What do you think I should include in the if statement? So if a person is 18 or above or older, then they can vote. And we talked about return.
If age is greater than or equal to 18.
18,
Age equal to true.
Interesting. Okay, age equals to true. So we are trying to return this information. Okay, so the return type over here is bool, and bool can be a true or false value. Okay, so when I say bool, then the return type or the return value is either true or false. So if age is greater than 18, then they can vote. So the answer or the return value should be
True.
True, exactly. That's basically what it is. So if age is greater than or equal to 18, then true, yes, they can vote. Else, return false, since they cannot vote if they are less than 18. Okay, awesome. So this is the tricky part. We are in the main function. So how, if you have any ideas, how do you think we can let the user know if they can vote or not? So we said we can either see out the result without storing it in a variable, or we can store it in a variable and check if it's a true or false value and act accordingly. Okay, so let's go with storing it in a variable. I think that's the safest option. So we are gonna store it in int result. Okay, and I'm storing the value of the function can vote in integer result. But there's something I did that is incorrect, and I want you to help me with that. I'm gonna keep making these mistakes so I can see if you're focusing with me or not. So int result equals can vote, and we're gonna include num or age. You can name it however you want. But remember, can vote has a Boolean return type. So what do you think the mistake here is?
It should be bool result.
That it's supposed to be bool result.
Exactly, it's supposed to be bool result. Excellent, girls. Also, we can keep it integer result, but we have to work with 1 and 0, since 1 is true and false, and 0 is false. But I want us to work with bool. I want us to work with different data types. So yes, excellent. Always be careful. So for example, if we have float cube and we stored the value of the function cube in an integer variable, the program is not going to give us an error, but the value that's going to send out to the user, or the value that it's going to print on the console, will be incorrect, since the return type of the function is float and not integer. So excellent. Here, our result, our return type is a Boolean value. So bool result is can vote num. And I mean, I'm going to include a prompt for now. See out, please enter your age. L, and L is not necessary, but I tend to include it for organization purposes. So bool result equals can vote. Okay, what's my next step? I want to let the user know if they can vote or not. What would my next step be?
If result is true.
Absolutely. If result equals true, then what would the answer be, Zaha?
See out, you can vote.
You can vote. Excellent. You can vote. Else, see out, you unfortunately cannot vote. Line. Also, we can say else if result equals false, but in this case, it's either true or false. There are only two possibilities, so we use else just for the sake of efficiency. So excellent. Again, so I run through the function again. This is a Boolean function called can vote. It receives one parameter, which is the age of the participant or the age of the student or whatever, and we can return a true or false value according to their age. So if they're greater than or equal to 18, we would return a true value, else we would return false. And again, it does not necessarily need to be a Boolean. We can return a string, for example. Okay, we can return a string, and if they are greater than or equal to 18, we can return yes, for example. Else we can return no. And we always have to be careful if we change these values and we change our return types, we also have to change our if statements over here. So if result equals yes, you can vote. Else, in this case, it would be no. See out, you cannot vote. It's the same thing. We can try it out and see. Oops, converter. Oh, so what do you think the error here is? There's something I forgot to do. What do you think? Something about the return type. So we're returning a string. What's the return type over here?
True or false?
It's true or false. It's a Boolean, right? But here we are returning a string. So we have to be careful. When we fix these values and we fix these return types, we also have to fix the return type of the function. So in this case, instead of Boolean, I have to switch it to string, both of course in the prototype and in the implementation below. Let's try to run our code and see. It's not supposed to give us any errors. Please enter your age. I'm going to enter 14. You cannot vote, unfortunately. Okay, awesome. So our code works. Now, before going on to different functions, and I want us to solve some functions together, I want us to actually, I want to introduce something new. Just 1 second. Okay, I'm gonna share again. Sorry for the inconvenience, girls. Just give me a second. Okay, I think you can see my screen. It's a new compiler page. So basically what I want us to introduce now, before we continue into different functions, I want us to talk about libraries. Now, if you remember, we talked about, and that's like, I guess it was in the first the absolute beginning of the programming club, and we talked about hash include IOStream. Now, this on top of the page, if we do not include this library in our program, then the function will basically won't function. Our program will not function. Since this library includes statements like cin, and cout, and if we do not include this library, then we cannot use cin and cout statements. And IOStream is input-output streams. So input is cin and output is cout. And there are, of course, many different statements and operations that we use in C++. But for now, we're going to be sticking with cin and cout. So this is one of the libraries. This is one of the essential libraries that we need in order for our program to basically execute the code properly and receive information from the user and basically print out information to the console. And there are so many different libraries in C++, but one of the most famous and well-known libraries would be the math library, which is called the CMath library. And whenever we are including a library, you would include #include CMath. And of course, there are so many different libraries in C++, but for now, we're just going to be talking about simple libraries and popular libraries like CMath. Now, this library actually includes many different mathematical operations and functions. And these functions include sine, cosine, square root, power, floor and ceiling, and we're going to be talking about these in a bit. So for example, if I wanted to find 2 to the power 3, if you remember, we used to actually create for loops or while loops in order for us to find these values. But when you use CMath, there are certain keywords and operations that you can use in order for you to attain that information instead of going through the whole hassle of a for loop and a while loop. So for example, if I wanted to see out 2 to the power 3, I would use how, okay, and include 2, 3 in between the parentheses. So the first one is the base, and the second value is the exponent. So when we run our code, it's supposed to give us 8, since 2 to the power 3 is 8. Awesome. So this is one of them. So for example, if I wanted to find the square root of 25, I would say square root 25. So square root only takes one parameter. And line, it's supposed to print 8 and 5. So the square root of 25 is 5. Now, there are so many different functions. There is ceiling and floor. So basically, ceiling, which we address as ceil, basically gives us it rounds up. So if we give it 5.4, for example, it would print 6 since the ceil function rounds up. And if I want to include a space in between and try a different operation called floor, it would basically round down. So if we go with 7.8, we'll see what the program gives us. So ceiling rounds up, floor rounds down, pow gives us the power, and square root gives us the square root of a number. So here, ceil 5.4, if we want to round up, it's supposed to give us 7, and with floor, rounding down would give us, if we want to round up, it would give us 6, and if we want to round down, it would give us 7. So I wanted to mention this library real fast, but again, there are so many different libraries in C++ that you can use, and they would ease the process for you as a programmer instead of having to write the program from scratch. So using some of these functions, I want you to help me write a slightly more complex function. So I want this function to find for example, n to the power of x. So I want us to write a function that receives two parameters, the base and the exponent, and I wanted to return the value or return the result into the main function, and then we would print it out to the user. Okay, so we're going to stick with integers for now. So int is our return type. We are going to be receiving the int main function is going to be receiving a integer value from this function, and I'm going to call it power. Okay, I'm going to give it two values, base and exponent. Okay, I want you guys to help me. Using the CMath library, I want us to figure out a way to return the value of b to the power of e. Okay, so what do you think? The function is pow, just so you can remember. I want you guys to help me.
Return pow be.
Excellent. So Yasmin decided to go with a shortcut. So instead of storing the instead of storing the result in int result and then returning result, Yasmin just decided to go with a quick shortcut and go with the operation b to the power of e. Okay, so Yasmin, I want you to help me. So how can we call this function inside the main function?
Power. First, we need to declare b and e. So n,
Excellent.
b, e. And then we have to cn b and e.
Absolutely. Cn, b, and e. Okay.
And then power parenthesis b comma e semicolon.
Excellent. Okay, so do I keep it as it is? What do you think?
You need to see out.
We need to see out, exactly. So we either see out or we can store it if we're going to be using the value later on in our program and we want to keep a hold of the value. We can simply store it in another integer value, call it integer result, integer value, integer anything. And by the way, b and e do not necessarily need to be the same name as as we have in the parameters over here. But again, just for the sake of clarity, I'm keeping them as the same thing just so we don't mess up the values. So for example, if we run our code, the program, we did not include a prompt, but I'm going to include 4 and 2, and it's going to give us 16. So let's try bigger numbers. Let's try 5 and 5. So 5 and 5. And it's going to give us 3,125. Okay, so this is a little more difficult, although we did it numerous times, but I'm going to keep the PAL functions and I'm going to remove the calls here in the main function. And I want you guys to help me find and create a function that receives a character and returns whether this character is an alphabet or not. And keep in mind, we are working with uppercase and lowercase. Okay? So I want you guys to help me. So so I'm going to call it alphabet. Okay? And I want you guys to help me from scratch. What do you think? I want it to return true if it's an alphabet and false if it is not an alphabet. What do you think?
Bool alphabet.
Excellent. Bool alphabet. So what do we include in the parameter?
We put a character.
Exactly. So we're receiving a character. So I'm going to call it character letter or alf, for example. And I'm going to copy the prototype and implement it below. Again, this isn't a necessary step. It's just for the sake of organization. Okay? So Bool alphabet, we are receiving a character. So this is the tough part, but we did it so many different times. So how do I establish whether this, whether alf is an alphabet or not? I'm gonna start with the first step. This is the easiest step. So what are we comparing here? What do you think?
If alf is greater than or equal to capital A and is less than or equal to capital letter Z.
Excellent.
Or,
okay. Perfect. Or
alf is greater than or equal to small case A and alf is less than or equal to small case Z.
Excellent. Yes, absolutely. Also, I always prefer to include parentheses. These are called redundant parentheses if I'm not wrong, but they're basically just, again, for the sake of clarity and just for the sake of organization as well. So here, what we're doing is comparing. We're seeing whether alf is greater than or equals to A and greater than or equal to Z, or if it's greater than or equal to lowercase a and greater than or less than lowercase z. Okay, so in this case, we figured out that it is an alphabet. What are we supposed to return? Again, this function has a Boolean return type. So what do we return?
True.
True. Excellent. So return true, else it's not a character in this case. It would return false. Perfect. Okay. So again, all we have to do is character letter, for example, cn letter, and I want you girls to help me. We're basically repeating concepts here. So what do you think? How are we going to be receiving the information that we're getting from the function alphabet? So the first step, the first thing we need to consider. Yasmin, do you wanna say something?
Yeah. If first we store it if you want.
Sure, we can do that. Okay.
Bool result equal to
result.
Alphabet alpha.
Is it alpha? So what are we returning?
A letter, sorry.
Letter. Excellent. Yes. Awesome. Okay.
Okay, if result equals true,
Equals true.
then C out letter is an alphabet.
It is an alphabet. Okay, perfect. And if it wasn't, what would be C out?
Else C out letter is not an alphabet.
Excellent. Letter is not an alphabet. Also, Yasmin mentioned something really interesting. So she was like, if we want to store it, we would store it in a Boolean variable, since the return type here is Boolean. But if we don't want to store it, we can just simply disregard this. I'm going to comment it out for now. Copy alphabet and just include it over here. Do you remember when we did the guessing game and we had different Boolean data types? If alphabet letter, which we are reserving from the user, is true, then C out letter is an alphabet, else C out letter is not an alphabet. If you remember, just including the, we used to just, so back in our previous sessions, we did not use functions. So for example, if alphabet was a Boolean, if it was a Boolean variable, we would just say if alphabet and assume this statement means if alphabet equals true. But instead of including equals true, in C++, we can just say if alphabet, and the compiler would understand that if alphabet is true, then enter and execute this code inside of here. But for now, since we are working with functions, we can do the same exact thing, just include the name of the function and include the parameters and send in the values that we want to send. So instead of storing it, we can just say if alphabet letter equals true. So let's try and see. So it's gonna wait for us to enter. I am going to enter this character, for example. It's gonna tell us that the asterisk is not an alphabet. Let's try the letter R, for example. R is an alphabet. So with Boolean, again, with Boolean functions, we could just treat them as if they are Boolean variables, and we could just include them inside the parentheses of the if statement, and the compiler would understand that, oh, so the what we're looking for here is that if alphabet parentheses letter is true, enter the if statement and execute the code. Excellent. Okay, so since this is our last programming session, I'm going to keep it short and sweet, but I want us to solve one last function. I want us to actually solve this together, since it might be a little tough and it might be a little tricky. And I want us to revise some of the information we talked about last session, where we talked about 2D arrays and nested loops. Okay, so I'm going to remove all of that. Okay, and I want you, if you read the email, I sent you a, it was an example, it was an extra practice example, and I think I included tricky next to it. It's a tricky question. So I want us to create a function, and it's going to be a void function. So it's not going to return anything. And the void function will be called shape, or triangle, let's say. And it's going to receive an integer number and a character. So I'm going to call it, I don't know what to call it. I'm going to call it letter. You know what? No, let's call it something a little shorter. Let's call it C. Keep it short. So what this function will do is that it will receive a number. For example, if num equals 5, it is going to print the character C as if it's a triangle. This is a tricky one. So for example, if C is this hashtag over here, it's going to print hashtag, 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 3 hashtags, 4 hashtags, and then 5 hashtags, since n equals 5. So it's going to print a triangular shape 5 times using the character that we send in the parameter here. Okay? This is a tricky one. So I want us to solve it together. So I'm gonna remove this. I'm gonna copy the prototype and implement it below the main. And let's see. So again, we are printing a triangle num times using the C character. And a big hint here is that we are going to be using nested loops. Okay? So the first time, the triangle, assuming C is, again, a hashtag, it's going to print it once. And then it's going to print it twice. And then it's going to print it 3 times. And then 4 times, and then 5 times if num was 5. Okay, so this is a tricky one, but I want to hear ideas. So what do you think? Are there any ideas for this function? So I give you a big hint. I said that we might need to use nested loops. So what do you think my first step would be?
Okay, so we need to start with the for loop.
Excellent. Okay.
For int I equal to 0.
Sure, we can go with 0, yeah.
Okay. I less than 5.
So is it gonna be always
Oh,
5?
No.
Excellent. Okay.
Okay. I plus plus.
Excellent. Okay.
Okay,
So this is
since
the tricky part.
a nested for loop, there's going to be another for loop.
Yes, exactly. So why do you think there's going to be another for loop?
Because the first time, okay, so in the example you gave above, so first of all, it's going to enter the first for loop as like 0, so it prints it once. But when we increment it, like, okay, I think we should start by 1 to make more sense. So
okay, that you can start from 0, by the way, but again, to make it look a little more organized. Yes.
So we started from 1. The first time it needs to print just 1 line. The second time, when we enter like the second row, it needs to it needs to print it 2 times. It needs to do this function twice at the same row. I don't know.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah.
Okay, so on and so forth. Exactly. So we are going to be using a nested for loop. I'm going to go with it, but I'm not going to fill in the values. I want you to help me fill in the values and then J++. And we're going to see out C, right? Since we're going to be, since C is a character. Okay, so as Yasmin mentioned, we are printing the character, we are incrementing the times that we are printing the character in every line. So the first line is going to be an asterisk. So let's stick with the hashtag. First line is going to be just once. We're going to be printing the hashtag once, and then 2 times, and then 3 times, and then assuming n equals 4, we're going to be printing it 4 times. So how exactly do we let the function know, or do we let the for loop know that we want you to print it once now, and then we want you to print it twice now, and then 3 times, and then 4 times? So when I is 1, J is going to print it. What do you think? So when I is 1, how many times is J going to print it?
1 time.
1 time, exactly. So when I is 2, how many times is J going to print C?
2 times.
2 times, exactly. And when it's 3, it's going to print it 3 times. And when it's 4, it's going to print it 4 times. And when it's 5, it's going to print it 5 times. So where do we start J and where do we end J every time?
We start at 0, or that we start at 1 and we end at I.
Excellent. We end at I because it's not going to be the same number every time, right? It's going to be 1, and then it's going to be 2. So when, exactly, so when I equals 1, j is going to be equal to 1. And when I equals 2, j is going to print from 1 to 2. When I equals 3, j is going to print from 1 to 3. So it's going to be 1, 2, and 3. And last but not least, when I is 4, j is going to repeat 4 times. So it's going to print 1 till 4. Oops. 1 till 4. So it's going to print 1, 2, 3, and 4. And that's why we need a nested loop in this case. So we don't always necessarily use nested loops for 2D arrays, but we do, of course, need nested loops to access 2D arrays. But we can use nested loops for so many different things. So let's try to run the code as it is, okay? And let's try to ask the user for the information. So we're gonna say int num and int num char L or C, doesn't matter. We're gonna see in num, see in C, and in this case, is there something the function is returning? Are we returning anything?
No.
No, right? So we technically do not need to print it out. We do not need to see out triangle or store it in a variable, since whenever the function is done, it's done and it continues in the main function. So it's just gonna do its job, and then the main function is gonna continue whatever lines of code that are below the triangle function. So the triangle function asks us to include 2 parameters, which are num and c. And now all we have to do is test our code. So I'm going to remove this since we don't need it right now. So I'm going to include 5 and this @ symbol, for example. Interesting. So why is it printing it right next to each other? There's something that we missed.
Go to the end line.
Exactly. So where do you think we should put the end line?
C after that. Sorry. After the first like big for loop.
Okay, so do I include it here or do I include it here?
Like right now, where the cursor is. Right.
Where the cursor is. Okay, perfect. So we do have to include the cout end L over here, because if we include end L inside the inner for loop, it's going to be printing all these values on different lines. But we want to create a triangular shape. We don't want to print the values each on different lines. So let's try again with the same values and see. So 5 and at. Awesome. So we have once, it repeated once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, and 5 times. What if I want, and this is the last question, I promise. What if I want to print this in reverse? So I want to print 5 A's, and then 4 A's, and then 3, and then 2, and then 1. There are some stuff that I need to change. What do you think? I want to print it in reverse.
We start int I is equal to num minus 1, and then I is less than or equal to 1, and then I minus minus. And
okay, so let's try. Yeah. So I'm going to copy. So Yasmin said num minus 1.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's try num minus 1, and I is greater than a 1.
Or equal.
Is that what you said? Or equal to 1. Okay, let's try. Let's try and see our code. So,
but
sorry.
I minus, also I minus minus.
I minus minus, excellent, yes. And that's my bad, since I forgot to include it. Okay, so let's see. I wanted to print it in reverse.
Wait. Not this for loop, the for loop inside.
The for loop inside, which one?
I think, I'm not sure though, The J for loop.
The J for loop. طب,
Oh
what do you
no,
think?
no,
Let's try to test.
it's true. Let's just test it.
It is right. It is right. Let's try to test and see. So the compiler was waiting for us to enter values. So I am going to enter 5 and exclamation mark this time. So excellent. So here's the thing. It gave us a really nice shape, but I wanted it to print this in reverse. Okay, but it started from 4. So why do you think it started from 4, Yasin?
It shouldn't be num minus 1.
Yeah, what should it be?
Only num.
Only num. Yeah, but actually, you know what? Your shape is actually so much nicer because now when we include num, it's just gonna print 5 again. But if you wanted to print it in reverse, you would have to include num and you set I to be greater than or equal to I. So here again, it printed it in reverse. So that's why. So you doubted yourself on the J one, but it's actually correct since J is going to be counting according to I. All right. So the thing we need to edit has to be the main loop or the upper loop and not the inner loop, since J relies on I. But in this case, since we want to print them in reverse, we would have to start in reverse and start I from num.
Yeah.
Excellent. So this was a slightly tricky question, but
Yeah.
you girls never disappoint me. So we got it right. We now know how to print a funny looking shape on C++. So I am going to stop recording and stop